Good Wednesday evening and welcome to this edition of From the Tomb with Cadoom. I am your host, Lucas Cadoom. Tonight we've got a fun one for you. We're introducing the Triangle series. This is going to be about all kinds of different geographical triangles similar to the Bermuda Triangle, where all these strange anomalies and disappearances, different out there oddities tend to happen. These kind of things tend to fascinate me, so let's not waste any time and let's get into it. There's a place in the American Midwest where ships vanish without distress calls, where planes fall from the sky without wreckage, where passengers disappear between two ports, and where radar sometimes shows echoes that shouldn't exist. They call this area the Lake Michigan Triangle. Tonight we examine 3 of its strangest disappearances and what that data tells us. There is a geographical triangle located on Lake Michigan between Ludington and Benton Harbor in Michigan and Manitowoc in Wisconsin. Lake Michigan is 22,300 square miles, making it the 5th largest lake in the United States and the 3rd largest of the Great Lakes. 321 miles long by 118 miles wide with a surface elevation of 579 feet and a maximum depth of 923 feet, being fed by approximately 100 streams. Lake Michigan is one for the ages. Lake Michigan is part of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway and then handles international commerce. The southern end of the lake abuts a great industrial complex centered on Chicago, and this consumes large quantities of waterborne raw materials, principally iron ore, coal, and limestone. These are handled at the ports of Calumet and South Chicago, and the East Chicago Harbor in Indiana, and the Gary Harbor in Indiana. Some of the iron ore is loaded at Escanaba, Michigan, on the lake's northern shore, but most is brought in from the Lake Superior region. Milwaukee and Green Bay, Wisconsin, are centers of distribution of coal from Lake Erie ports. Grain is shipped from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Chicago. Other major ports on the lake include Michigan City, Indiana, Waukegan, Illinois, Kenosha, Wisconsin, Racine and Manitowoc in Wisconsin, and Manistee, Ludington, Muskegon, Grand Haven, and Benton Harbor in Michigan. The restocking of lake trout and the introduction of coho salmon have rejuvenated recreational and commercial fishing on the lake as well. Lake Michigan has highly volatile weather, acting as a massive heat sink, driving sudden unpredictable changes, including lake effect snow, sudden steep wave development, and dramatic temperature swings. This helps boost thunderstorm activity by 50% and can generate 400% more hail days on the eastern shore of the lake. There is also slight magnetic variations on Lake Michigan that would affect compasses and other electronic devices. This can range anywhere from 4 to 6 degrees between true and magnetic north. This is a localized anomaly because of the lake bed and surrounding areas containing magnetic anomalies related to the geography. Lake Michigan beaches also contain 1 to 3% magnetite, black sand, which causes local minor magnetic variations as well. There's been a history of magnetism causing shifts in the lake's sediment sources. Records shown a normal polarity over the last 13,000 years, but before that, rapid excursions occurred around 9,000 to 14,000 years ago. There are also a few geographic anomalies that help contribute to all of this. Recent surveys in 2022 show roughly 40 large 300 to 600 foot wide sinkholes about 500 feet deep. Then there's the Lake Michigan Stonehenge, located in Grand Traverse Bay. There's a series of stones arranged in a circle 40 feet below the surface. One allegedly has a carving of a mastodon, suggesting it could be over 10,000 years old. Then we have a significant magnetic anomaly identified in the 40s near Bear Lake in Houghton County, involving igneous rock in an area with otherwise weak magnetic properties. Then there's deep crustal structures in the northern Lake Michigan, showing evidence of ancient tectonic activities and deformations. But patterns only matter when they repeat. So let's get into the first case, that of Captain George R. Donner. On April 28th, 1937, the ship the O.S. McFarland headed across Lake Michigan to a power plant in Port Washington, Wisconsin, transporting over 9,800 tons of coal from starting point in Erie, Pennsylvania. At the time, this wasn't considered a difficult trip, but it was made significantly slower from the frozen state of the Great Lakes. Donner had been sailing officially for decades, no stranger to the Great Lakes at all. Born in 1879, we can assume that he was on the water even longer in some capacity. He was employed by the Valley Camp Steamship Company for over 10 years as a skipper and mate on various ships. Donner then transferred employment when the company was purchased by Columbia Transportation Company, which was under ownership of the Ogle Bay Norton Corporation in 1935. After 2 years without a single voyage in 1937, the company grants Donner the rank of captain, and he was given full command over the O.S. McFarland. His first official voyage of the season would begin on April 25th. His tasks were the transportation of coal, and he was 51 years old at this point. At 10:20 p.m., after successfully navigating the Straits of Mackinac with only manageable ice floes around them, the captain ordered the speed of the ship down for safety purposes and stepped away from his post. The stress of navigating through the frozen straits had taken its toll over the past few hours, and he informed his first and second mate that he was retiring to his cabin. He told them to wake him when they passed Sheboygan and started approaching Port Washington. This was estimated to take approximately 3 hours. Donner then headed to his cabin, which was at the back of the pilot house, down a companionway. Then 3 hours later, at 1:20 a.m., now April 29th and Captain Donner's birthday, the second mate approached the cabin to wake Donner like he asked. He knocked the first time and there was no answer. He proceeded to call for the captain again, and there was still no answer. He decided Captain Donner couldn't hear him for some reason and tried to enter the room, but when he attempted to turn the handle, it wouldn't move. Apparently, the door was locked from the inside. The second mate then went to retrieve the master key, thinking the captain would sleep past the point he insisted, causing problems with the docking. He then brings up first mate Charles Riker up to speed. He headed back to the cabin and unlocked the door. He made his presence known before descending the stairs. He assumed Donner would answer and invite him in, but once again, there was no answer. Now he was worried the captain went through some sort of medical emergency. The second mate opened the door and went inside, but what he seen was not what he expected. In front of him was nothing but an empty room. Captain Donner, it appeared, was gone. Confused, he began to search the small room, and it was completely empty. Nothing seemed out of place. The bed did not appear to be slept in, and the porthole windows were securely fastened. But even if they weren't, no one could have been able to fit through them. He hurried to the first mate to inform him of the situation and started a search of the ship immediately, thinking the captain may have left the room shortly before he arrived. They began to check the whole ship, top to bottom, every room, every crate, no stone left unturned. The captain was to be found before they docked in Port Washington. However, the search proved useless as Captain George R. Donner was never found on board. When the O.S. McFarland docked in Port Washington, the crew alerted the proper authorities to tell them their captain was missing under mysterious circumstances. The authorities alerted the Coast Guard on the lake, and immediately a search was started. They promised the captain would be found and the mystery would be solved. But again, that did not happen, and Captain Donner was never located. At daybreak, the rescue became a body recovery, and every ship on the same route was alerted to keep an eye out. Again, there was nothing. It appeared the captain had simply vanished into thin air, never to be seen again. The authorities questioned the crew as to what happened that night. The crew could only give scarce information. At 10:20, Donner retired to his room. Movement could be heard inside the cabin for 2 hours that sounded like Donner was going through paperwork, possibly getting ready for the docking. Outside of the actual disappearance, authorities did learn some interesting information about the overall state of Donner. Port Washington Sheriff Ben F. Runkle learned that Donner was in a highly nervous state throughout the trip because the ship's compasses at the fore and aft were not functioning for some reason. This caused Donner not to rest, even going as far as to forego sleep altogether to keep an eye on their position. Then, from the ship's steward, the sheriff learned that Donner had approached him and told him he was not feeling well, but would not explain any further. Then he asked the steward if he would stay in his room for the night, to which the steward politely declined. For days, coastal communities in Michigan and Wisconsin kept an eye out, but no one ever washed up on shore. Rumors went around that the captain tried to off himself. Others speculated that he was murdered and tossed overboard not long after passing through the Straits of Mackinac. Both possibilities are plausible but still unconfirmed. There are also people who believe it wasn't natural at all, and Donner was taken by something. Unfortunately, though, Donner just ended up another statistic on the victim list of Lake Michigan Triangle. Our next story starts the day before North Korea invaded South Korea, June 23, 1950. It was a warm Friday night as passengers boarded Northwest Airlines Flight 2501, bound for Seattle with a layover in Minneapolis. They were looking forward to a long yet comfortable flight aboard the Douglas DC-4 quad-propeller converted World War II cargo plane that could hit 280 miles an hour. Manned by 35-year-old Captain Robert C. Lind of Hopkins, Minnesota, the co-pilot Vern F. Wolf, and stewardess Bonnie Ann Feldman, the plane had 55 passengers on board, 27 women, 22 men, and 6 children. Flying level at 3,500 feet, they passed over Cleveland and headed west. They passed over Battle Creek at 11:51 p.m. As the plane reached the shore of Lake Michigan, Captain Lind knew about storms over the lake and requested to be dropped down to 2,500 feet, but that was denied due to other traffic in the area. And that was the last anyone heard from Flight 2501, marking the largest aviation disaster in history up to that point. It should be noted again that these planes were no wimps. They were developed for the military in World War II for cargo planes, then converted after the war due to a surplus, with a few more new models of planes being added to meet demand. These planes were also used by major names of the time personally and as Air Force One for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Captain Lind had been flying since 1941. He had over 500 hours in this type of aircraft, as he had been certified 5 years earlier and maintained his certification on this aircraft. In the 90 days prior to this incident, he had logged 105 hours in just DC-4s, making 15 round trips on routes similar to this one. He had his full 24-hour rest period and was perfectly capable of handling this flight, while the co-pilot had flown for the company almost as long and was capable in his own right. Just before midnight, after the request to lower altitude denial, Northwest Radio at Milwaukee advised New York that 2501 was overdue at Milwaukee. At that point, all Civil Aeronautics Administration towers began trying to contact 2501 on all frequencies, but they never made contact. At this point, Northwest Air Traffic Control alerted all sea air rescue stations to stand by as the flight was missing. At dawn's light, it was clear the DC-4 had crashed. At 5:30 a.m. Saturday, June 24th, the plane was officially presumed lost as the fuel supply would have been depleted, and the search and rescue teams began the intense search. The Navy, Coast Guard, and state police teams from Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin were all utilized. 13 hours later, at 6:30 p.m. Saturday evening, the Coast Guard cutter, Woodbine, found an oil slick, aircraft debris, and an airline logbook floating in Lake Michigan, many miles from the shore. At 5:30 a.m. Sunday morning, sonar work by the Navy vessel Daniel Joy near the oil slick revealed a multitude of targets. 3 Coast Guard vessels, Woodbine, Hollyhock, and Frederick Lee, focused on the recovery of floating debris that included a fuel tank float, seat cushions, clothing, blankets, luggage, cabin material, and body parts. The authorities wanted to determine if this was a mid-air explosion or if the plane struck the water intact, but these were the only clues they had. The initial report suggested the plane exploded in mid-air between Glen and South Haven, Michigan, but officials began discovering debris and body parts in a 4-mile area 12 miles northwest of Benton Harbor. The Coast Guard and Berrien County prosecutor Louis Kerlikowski speculated that the plane may have been twisted in the high winds, causing a spark that ignited the fuel tanks. There was doubt that there were any pieces left that were worth diving to recover. However, Northwest still requested a diver from the Coast Guard to check, but that request was denied, so they then moved on to the Navy. It was said over the next few days, parts kept floating to the surface, but the biggest was, and I quote, the size of your hand. A week later, 2 partial bodies of women were discovered, one 2 miles north of South Haven and the other 7 miles north at Glen, Michigan. 4 Coast Guard cutters were deployed to keep recovering wreckage and transport press to the scene. Authorities in South Haven closed the popular South Beach for 9 days due to the large number of body parts washing in amongst the swimmers. On Tuesday the 27th, it was reported that the Coast Guard was conducting dragging efforts to locate a large enough piece of debris to justify lowering divers to the lake floor. The following day, the Navy's divers spent 6 hours looking for the wreckage of the plane, but there was no sign of it at all. There were multiple reports of the plane flying over a gas station at 12:15 a.m., where they heard plunk noises twice from the motors, then saw an odd flash of light. July 17th, Wallace Chambers, a local fisherman, snagged something in his nets 4 miles southwest of South Haven in 72 feet of water. A small twisted piece of metal was recovered and turned over to the Coast Guard. It was later determined that it was doubtful to be from the DC-4. 6 months later, the cause of the disappearance was officially listed as unknown. In 2004, Michigan's Shipwreck Research Association joined with one of my favorite authors, Clive Cussler, who operates the nonprofit National Underwater Marine Agency, mounting expeditions to find the world's most famous lost vessels. They conducted a 500 square mile sonar search of the area. Between 2004 and 2013, they didn't discover anything, besides 9 shipwrecks, searching about 1 month each spring. Clive then pulled his team until 2015 to 2017 when the MSRA drew him back in. They found 2 new shipwrecks, but still nothing on Flight 2501. The wreckage still hasn't been found to this day. And now our last disappearance story of the day, the Thomas Hume. The Thomas Hume was a schooner built in Manitowoc, Wisconsin in 1870. The ship was christened as the H.C. Albrecht after its first owner, Captain Harry Albrecht. In 1876, the ship was sold to Captain Welch from Chicago, who the following year sold it to Charles Hackley, a lumber mill owner. He owned the Hackley Hume lumber mill on Muskegon Lake. He renamed the ship the Thomas Hume in 1883 after Hackley's business partner. In addition to the new name, it was refitted to safely transport lumber from Muskegon to Chicago. The frame was strengthened, a new deck was added, and a third mast was also added. The Thomas Hume sailed Lake Michigan until 1891, when it suddenly disappeared without a trace. On May 21st, 1891, the Thomas Hume was last seen leaving Chicago for Muskegon after unloading. It was sailing alongside the Rouse Simmons, which was another ship owned by the company, with a crew of 7. A storm barreled up on the lake, and the captain of the Rouse Simmons decided to make a U-turn and head back to Chicago, to which he made it safely. The Thomas Hume decided to risk the journey and was never seen again. Charles Hackley and Thomas Hume dispatched Captain Seth Lee to search when the ship never made it to the port in Muskegon. Not a single piece of wreckage was found. The 7 crew members were assumed dead, and the company had to write off the disappearance as a $6,000 loss because the ship was uninsured. Hackley and Hume persisted in their search, even offering a large reward for information, but the reward was never claimed. This has led to a number of speculations on its fate. Some say the crew stole the ship and turned it into another vessel. Others say the ship was struck and sunk by a much larger freighter on the lake, and the captain swore his crew to secrecy. Yet some still say the ship was a victim of a paranormal phenomenon, and it sailed unknowingly into the Lake Michigan Triangle. In 2006, the mystery was finally laid to rest when the Thomas Hume was dramatically rediscovered. Taras Lysenko, a diver with A&T Recovery, came across an almost intact vessel at the bottom of the southern portion of Lake Michigan, remarkably well preserved as it had sunk to extreme depths far into the lake where it lay undisturbed. They then turned the wreck over to the Michigan Shipwreck Association and a respected team of Chicago underwater explorers. Tools, coins, clothing, and jewelry were all found on the wreck, deeming it to be described as a time capsule from 115 years ago. Today, research still continues on the Thomas Hume in hopes of finally piecing together its last hours. 3 disappearances, 3 decades apart, different vessels, different conditions, same geography. Could it have been the sudden weather shifts known on Lake Michigan? The storms blowing up rapidly, staying longer, being increased by intensity by the lake effects? The hot water, the cold water mixing together, mixing with the hot and cold air, causing rapid changes in intensity and weather? Or could it have been the magnetic deviations causing compasses to go awry and making electrical systems malfunction, causing errors with these different crews and vessels, making them disappear in each in their own way, whether it be at the bottom of the lake or completely vanished? Yet how does that explain Captain Donner? How could he have disappeared? A single person, randomly, with the door locked from the inside. Then there's also the standing wave. These occur when waves of the same intensity and frequency travel in opposite directions, creating fixed points in a medium. So what does that mean? Think of water in a container. You tap the water and the water is disturbed. The waves come out and back in at the same intensity and speeds. And the height of the waves and the valley of the waves are equal, which then causes ships to violently rise up and down and be slammed by these waves and eventually capsize. Or are we just talking about simple human error where these captains made a mistake and got off of course or hit something in the water or another ship took them out? Or say for the plane, did they just fly too low and some weather shift in the storm caused turbulence that they couldn't recover from in time and it hit the water? Or did it twist and spark that fuel tank and explode in midair and basically disintegrate so there were no pieces left to find at all? But that still doesn't explain what happened to Captain Donner. If the door was locked from the inside, how could anybody have murdered him to toss him overboard? How could he have gotten out on his own if the portholes weren't small enough for anybody to fit through? There are so many questions left unanswered. Which one is your favorite? Let me know. Start leaving your theories in the comments, because once this series is over, we'll have a lot to choose from. And I want to entertain you guys with people and things you want to see, not just the stuff that fascinates and entertains me. I want to broaden your horizons, but I also want to broaden my own. The thing we need to take from this episode is some places don't return everything. Some places keep things. And that can be mentally, physically, emotionally, financially. It doesn't matter. You have to be aware of the dangers around you. So tune in next week. We're going to cover another triangle, the most well-known of the triangles of this style, the Bermuda Triangle, Huron, From the Tomb with Cadoom. Next week, Wednesday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll talk to you then. But until then, keep it twisted and escape your tomb.